With the Chinese Communist Party Congress opening on Sunday and President Xi Jinping expected to win a historic third term as party general secretary, in the midst of growing murmurs of dissent against him, China seems set to go even deeper into what has been described as techno-autocracy. Xi continues to dominate as a singular leader, but there are expectations of some rough headwinds for him. Not given to collective decision making, there have been reports of opposition mounting against Xi. To understand what all this means, Mayank Chhaya Reports spoke to Dr. Orville Schell, America's foremost China scholar, author, and the Arthur Ross Director of the Center on U.S. China Relations at Asia Society in New York. Dr. Orville Schell.
Uh, Thank you for your time, Dr. Schell. I'm greatly appreciative. You are always generous with me.
Glad to do it.
With the Chinese Communist Party Congress starting tomorrow and Xi Jinping's likely appointment for a historic third term, is he also set to become, in your words, an immortal revolutionary that he wants to be?
Well, I think there's great aspiration on the part of Xi Jinping to become an immortal revolutionary. In other words, to write himself very largely in history, as Mao Zedong did. I think he has that kind of big leader culture complex. And I think this 20th Party Congress could have been a kind of a coronation. However, I have to say that one of the most striking things, and this is, of course, before the Congress opens, in my view, is that at the very time that he seeks to write himself in history so largely, he has also done so much to undermine China's economy, China's position in the world, and China's sort of reputation, which was not too bad 10 years ago in terms of its economic miracle, it's the China boom, its willingness to peacefully rise, and other things like that. So there's a tremendous amount of contradiction and paradox, I think, in this party Congress, that in the one sense, you sense him surging towards the high point of his career as a successful leader, and I should say dictator. But on the other hand, he's done so much to undermine the very things which might make his story a success story.
And yet, there is every expectation that he would be made General Secretary for a third time.
Yes, because I think he has defoliated and suppressed anybody's capacity to either criticize him, much less to organize an alternative power bloc against him. I think there's no doubt he's going to be, he will be the get a third term. That was set when they changed the Constitution to allow the president, which is a throwaway term, to have a third term. But the party general secretaries have had no limitation, and to be the head of the party is what matters, not to be the head of the state.
Do you think, in effect, he can choose to be the leader of China until he dies, if that's his choice?
Well, that seems to be what he would like, because as soon as you appoint a successor, it doesn't matter if it's 1 year out, 5 years out, 10 years out, people are already thinking, well, this isn't a through train. This person has a shelf life. And he's not willing to do that, because the minute he does that, he will lose an immense amount of power. So he has to look like he can be et aeternam, go forever, in order to keep his hold on power. So I think no doubt he'll get a third term, and I would say he'd love to have a fourth, but let's see.
Speaking of shelf life, he is almost 70 now. And with this 5-year term, he would be 75, which is still reasonably young in the context of things there. But don't you think mortality is something that someone like him would be concerned about?
Well, mortality is indeed upon all of us, but you began this discussion by noting the notion of revolutionary immortality. And what that means is that even when your mortal body dies and you are leave the stage, at least actually, you go on in immortal form, as Mao Zedong has in certain ways. And I think that's curiously what Xi Jinping is hoping for, that he will become so much a part of the party, the state, and this whole Chinese historical development that he will not be forgotten even in death.
Right. You've been a lifelong and great China scholar. Is this your understanding that China has had a long history of rulers wanting to be immortal beyond their natural lives?
I think there's always been a bit of that, as there was in imperial China with emperors that wanted to somehow, the idea of the grand progenitor, the Taizu, was had some of this blush. But I think it was really Mao Zedong who gave this a fully fledged definition. I mean, Deng Xiaoping did not seem to be this way. Hu Yaobang was not.
Right.
Zhao Ziyang was not. Even Jiang Zemin, very affable, sometimes clown-like, but actually quite willing to interact with and wanted to be part of the global community, was not this way. Hu Jintao, sort of, it's hard to read him,
Right.
but Xi Jinping is another story. He wants to write himself grandly, and his real dilemma is that he urgently wants to be respected internationally, and yet he steadfastly refuses to act respectably.
Right.
So if you won't act respectably, you probably won't be respected, and then you will take umbrage, and then you will consider everybody as a hostile foreign force. And the saddest thing of all about that scenario is then you lose your own sense of agency to change things. Everything gets blamed on outside forces.
Do you wonder about the origin or the genesis of this grand ambition that he has? I'm sure you've tracked him for a long time. Were there signs early on that he's that kind of leader?
Well, I watched him. I went on two trips, one with Vice President Biden and him, and watched him on that trip. And then I went with Trump to China and watched. That was quite a piece of theater to see Trump and Xi Jinping together. And I think what you see with Xi, if my reading is correct, he does not feel comfortable in global company. He cannot speak another language. He's never been abroad. He's very provincial. There's a word in Chinese, tu baozi, which means you're a kind of a hick. In a certain sense, he is very provincial. And he, I think, has a lot of complexes that derive from that. And what that means is then that he doesn't kind of make friends with leaders, but he wants to impress foreign leaders with pomp, circumstance, ceremony, and the grandeur of the Great Hall of the People, Tiananmen Square, the Forbidden City, all of these things. So he uses ceremony as a way to signal foreign leaders that he's of consequence, not like Biden, who's slapping people on the back and laughing and just wants to make friends.
Right.
There's none of that with Xi. So yes, I think Xi Jinping is a man who's very aloof, very uncertain about his standing in the world, very sensitive to any slights, has a tremendous face issue, but his deportment, of course, does not give foreign leaders much ground to buddy up with him and feel comfortable with him.
Right. I ask this in the context of recent speculations of rising dissensions. How invincible is he really at this stage?
I think he's everything in the world of revolutionary immortality depends on appearing infallible and all knowing, all powerful, and evincing no sign of weakness. And he's not done a very good job on that. We see him doing things, his posture towards private entrepreneurs, his treatment of the zero COVID policy, his attack on IPOs, his undermining of the Chinese economy, his alienation of many, many countries. I mean, what Chinese leader alienates India, Canada, Australia, and Sweden? I mean, the original non-aligned nations. And
Right.
why should he alienate them? There's no reason, but he did it. And it says something that I think we really do need to pay attention to. And those things make it very hard for him to succeed.
But doesn't that run counter to China's ambition to be a sort of the next power after the United States? And I'm sure he wants to be the one shepherding that.
Yes, absolutely true. And therein lies the paradox of Xi Jinping. Grand pretensions, great big China dream, wants to see China be respected in the world and actually condition the world and to make the world a little more safer for autocracy, all of these things. And yet, he is doing so much to undermine his very position that you have to wonder if he isn't, in some sense, a kind of a tragic hero whose flaws, ambitions, overweening ambition will not make him come a cropper.
Right. You have argued that Taiwan and its intrinsic its takeover are intrinsic to Xi's conception of himself as a sort of a grand progenitor. Would you care to elaborate on that?
Well, I think, he has the Chinese Communist Party's platform, which of course used to have Marxism and Leninism, that has had a whole social program. She has a little of that in common prosperity. But the biggest piece of the old communist agenda is to unify the motherland. And they don't mean the Ming Dynasty motherland or the Tang Dynasty motherland. They mean the imperial Qing Dynasty motherland, which included Tibet, Xinjiang, even Mongolia, Manchuria, Taiwan, Macau, and who knows, maybe there are some other bits and pieces of India, like in Ladakh,
Right.
or the whole of Assam up in the border regions of Burma, which China claims, and a vast territory which we've heard nothing about. So all of these things are part of what I think Xi views as a crucial part of his sort of old Marxist-Leninist agenda to bring the motherland, to reunify it. And he's staked so much on it, he can't back down now on Taiwan. I mean, Mao Zedong said, it doesn't matter if it takes 100 years, we're not going to push it. Deng Xiaoping in 1979, on his way to Washington to meet with President Jimmy Carter, said in Japan, listen, a few generations more, Taiwan is ours, but we're not going to push it. But Xi has not said that. He said sooner rather than later.
Right.
It cannot be pushed to new generations.
You have been visiting Taiwan since 1961 and China since 1975. The China Taiwan standoff has always seemed to be on the verge of an escalation. What is different this time?
Well, I think there was it's been through some very big changes. When I first went there, of course, there was a complete standoff, the complete alienation. And Chiang Kai-shek even promised that he would be counterattacking the mainland and driving the communist government off and restoring nationalist power. But then, we came into a period where Taiwan had its own form of engagement under Mayank Chhaya, where it looked quite hopeful. And that's the period when Taiwan was investing hundreds of billions of dollars in Taiwan. And, almost 500,000 Taiwanese lived there, worked there. And we thought maybe things would quietly come together and China would reform and change enough so that Taiwan would feel comfortable and could accept one country, two systems. And then, of course, China gobbled up Hong Kong, and that was the end of that hope. So, yes, we've been through some, and now we're back at animosity again.
Right.
And I don't see any way out of it. I don't see any off ramps. I don't see the Chinese Communist Party even willing to discuss it.
I'm very interested in your perspective on how you look at China's ambition to be a sort of a techno superpower and the fact that Taiwan is the largest manufacturer of semiconductors and chips that they desperately want. How does that play into Xi's overall ambitions about China?
Well, I think, at one point, at different points in history, different things are the turnkeys of international trade. And at this point in our history, microprocessors, which run everything from your
Right,
toaster to the hypersonic, glide missiles. And so China, as you will recall, under the Mao area, was dedicated to self-sufficiency, autarky, 自力更生. And we thought we'd vacated that period by all becoming globalized. Didn't matter where things were made as long as we could get them cheaply and quickly. So we offshored stuff in America, and actually China too became dependent on the global market, if for nothing else, to sell things. And now we find ourselves that fabric ripping apart. And Taiwan had its version of this. I mean, it has like Foxconn makes
right,
all Apple's phones and iPads and laptops in China. How do you get that decoupled? There are moving some things, some phone line assembly lines to India, but it's very, very difficult. So we're in a very difficult position where to become antagonistic toward a country which we are dependent on, and nowhere is that dependency greater than in microchips. Even
right,
TSMC, that makes 92% of all the world's microchips on Taiwan, and 52% of all of its 92% of all chips, but 50% of its high-end cutting edge chips is deeply embedded in China. They have
right.
fabs there. They sell to China. How is this decoupling going to work? And
You
these
know,
companies are going to have a great problem.
somebody said half in jest that maybe China should just will probably take over just the company and not the country.
Well, the problem with that is that the TSMC is an incredible company, but China could not take it over because it is dependent on companies in Europe and America for maintenance, for computer upgrades, for gases, for solvents on
Right,
Japan. In other words, it too is a deeply globalized supply chain. And
right,
if it just came in and occupied the fab, it would stop work in a few days. It couldn't go on. Never mind that most of the engineers in Taiwan would probably run off to America.
right.
So this is a very complicated question. If China were to take over Taiwan, what would they get in terms of microprocessors? I don't think they'd get much.
That's an interesting perspective. You have also written that she wants the Taiwanese territory, but not necessarily its people.
Yeah.
Is,
So,
is that really achievable for him?
well,
How do you do that?
the people are troublemakers, and yet he's committed to taking the territory, right? I
Right,
don't think he'd mind seeing the people vanish, except the people do have skills and abilities, but they're also a headache for him. So he's created a number of insoluble problems and in my view, totally unnecessarily so. He had a really good thing going, both with the global economy and Taiwan. And why did he mess it up? That's, I think, the question of questions. And I think he did it because of this sort of strange complex of being the great leader like Mao Zedong, and finding umbrage everywhere when people don't respect his form of government and won't say, oh, it's all right if you lock up 1 million people in Xinjiang, no problem. Just keep sending the denim jeans to Europe and America and all's good. It's not going to happen. But that's what he wants.
You interestingly referred to his provincial impulses. How much of that plays into his perhaps a sense of inferiority when it comes to the global stage?
Well, you know well that China has a whole victim culture. They speak of, and this started with the nationalists in the 20th century, the 100 years of victimization and humiliation. And they speak constantly about it. She still very sensitive to any idea that the West will look down upon China, won't respect China, won't include China as an equal. And this grows out of course, the whole narrative of Leninist, imperialism, colonialism, oppression, occupation, victimization, which has some truth to it. But the problem is that China is also an immense success story. And you can't at once be successful and be a victim. So he's caught himself on an old narrative, but a new reality. And one would think he'd say, listen, we are a success story. Let's peacefully rise, as originally they said they were going to do. Let's just calm down here and not threaten each other and help us enjoy our immense progress. I mean, it was within my lifetime that China was referred to as the sick man of Asia.
Right.
And it has, in fact, done miraculous things. And yet, Xi Jinping has pulled the rug out from under his country and its ability to enjoy its own progress and success. And I think that's sort of astounding when you think about it, because there's so much to be proud of.
Why is he? Why do you think he's lacking in such obvious intelligence? What you just laid out.
I don't think it's intelligence. I think it's more, I think he's a smart man. I think, as I say, it's a combination of provincialism and also a strange psychological syndrome, which we have a very difficult time factoring into policy questions, where he feels insecure. And he feels somehow that as an autocrat, he cannot be appreciated in the very company that he wants to find sanction from, and wants to find support and wants to be praised by. So in a certain sense, he is a kind of as I've written, a kind of a Greek tragic hero,
Right.
whose overweening ambition, but coupled with his tragic flaws, make it impossible for him to do anything except perhaps to pull the whole country down around his ears. I hope that doesn't happen, but he is a complicated human being. At the same time, he's a deft politician.
That leads me to ask you whether there is any potential rival rising in the immediate future or in the maybe short-term future.
When I first went to China in 1975, Mao Zedong was still alive. The Cultural Revolution was still going on. And I was there for 2 months. And there was not one whiff, one scintilla of evidence to suggest that Mao had competitors. I mean, we did sort of know that at certain periods there had been some people and disagreements, nor did we see any sign of potential change. And yet then Mao died, and everything, as you know, in the late 70s, early 80s, started to change. Those forces are incipient still within China. But Xi has done such an extraordinary job with his new techno-autocracy and surveillance system that we just cannot see what is really going on. Every now and then someone will hang a banner from a bridge in Beijing, opposing dictatorship, but we have no real sense of what the public mood actually is. And I think in my experience, I was married to a Chinese, lived in China. My whole family speaks Chinese. Even Chinese don't know what's going on. They can't make sense out of it.
That's astonishing. Yeah, that's astonishing.
No, it is astonishing. It bespeaks of the black box of the Chinese Communist Party. which wants to rule over people, not rule with people.
Right. Just last two, three things, Dr. Schell. Going by the popular sentiments on the island of Taiwan that you have talked about, reunification seems completely off the table because the support for it has dwindled toward just about 2%.
There's
Does,
not a snowball's chance in hell that
does
Taiwan will reunify with China willingly at this point in history. Now, that could change. And I think that's what they should shoot. They should adopt Deng Xiaoping and Mao Zedong's formula. Let's not push it now. At some point, decades from now, possibly, China will become more open, and then let's reconsider it. In the meanwhile, Taiwan is ours.
right.
But they're stuck on a dilemma that if Taiwan declares independence, which many people would like to do, and actually it's one of the great principles of the United Nations, self-determination. If Quebec can leave Canada and Scotland can leave England and the Czechoslovakia can break into two pieces, why not Taiwan and China?
Right. Does that mean a war in the mold of Ukraine-Russia could happen?
It could. I think we really don't know yet what the effect of the Ukraine will be on Xi Jinping or Taiwan. My sense of having been in Taiwan is that the effect there is profound, that they are now beginning to learn how to decentralize their defenses, asymmetrical warfare, more small things spread around. They're going to increase conscription to a year, a number of things. But I think also Xi Jinping may suddenly realize, boy, this is not a good idea, invading another piece of territory, even if you think it's yours, because it could be the end of your empire.
Right.
Putin wants to build an empire. He may end up watching his empire be dismantled even more.
Explain to me this point you've made. 50 years ago, which is in 1972, Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger teamed up with Mao and Zhou Enlai against the USSR. We now have a situation where Beijing and Moscow seem to be teaming up against America. How do you explain this switch?
Opportunism. And I think that, China, since the Communist Party came into being, has had a very complicated relation with the Soviet Union and Russia. And it is one of opportunism. And I think that Xi Jinping finds himself now in a very difficult place, because if there's one thing Xi does believe in, it's sovereignty. That's why he thinks the United States shouldn't interfere in Taiwan. But if he supports Russia violating the Ukraine sovereignty, which it has pledged to support, China has,
right,
then what does that say about everybody else's relations to Taiwan? So he's in a very difficult place here.
Coming to Tibet, that issue is more or less dead. It's not going to go anywhere. Do you think there's any prospect of Tibet getting any of what the Dalai Lama has been asking for?
I think, in a curious way, Xinjiang has trumped Tibet. It is the new Tibet, the new place where atrocities are happening, the new place where the world is fixated, and Tibet is sort of forgotten. We kind of just gave up on Tibet, sadly, because we couldn't do anything, and China was diluting the Tibetan population with Han, immigrants. It was building roads. I don't know what will happen. Dalai Lama is now quite elderly. It's a very sad story of a kind of communist imperialism.
For the foreseeable future, America will remain the only sort of counter to China as it rises even more. In that dynamic, where do you think China sees India?
I think China very foolishly attacked in Ladakh. And of course, as you well know, set off a whole series of sort of catalytic effects within India and engendered a whole new wave of animosity towards China. But of course, India did join AUKUS, the Quad, excuse me.
Right.
And it's still not voting against China in the UN. It's abstaining. It's still dependent on a lot of Soviet armaments, and so it has to be careful with Russia. I trust India under Modi will slowly move more and more into sort of the alliance realm, but it has to be a little careful in how it does that. But again, it seems to me, if you're looking at Xi Jinping, the attack in Ladakh was just foolish to the extreme, because it had India, which was one of the first countries to recognize China in the 50s. It was a non-aligned nation. It so antagonized India that it started pushing it into the other column, into the other alliance. Why do that over a couple of pile of rocks in Ladakh? It's not easy to explain.
And before I let you go, would you like to speculate about what eventually happens to Tibet? You already said it's a dead issue, more or less. Do you see any hope at all beyond the current Dalai Lama things happening at all?
Well, in 1979-80, when Hu Yaobang came into office after the Cultural Revolution, there was an amazing period where he pulled back all the Han Chinese cadres from Tibet, where he allowed the Dalai Lama's sister to go to, I think it was to the border regions or in Qinghai, their homeland. Amazing things started to happen. And we thought actually there could be some sort of greater autonomy within the sort of Chinese imperium. But then, of course, Hu Yaobang got kicked out.
Right.
So it is possible that under a new leadership, and there are the incipient abilities within China to be more open, more democratic, more tolerant, it is possible that such a period could come again. I think it's going to be very difficult for Tibet to gain any kind of independence, however. I don't foresee, at least in the near future, China doing that. Although when you look at dynastic history, you see China growing and shrinking in different periods as it adopts border regions, and then control grows weak and it has to let them go. I think Tibet is one of the great tragedies of the last 2 centuries, and I don't see a solution soon.
In any case, this is the last Dalai Lama in terms of having any broader influence, because once Tenzin Gyatso passes, by the time the new Dalai Lama becomes effective, it will be, I doubt if it will ever happen.
Well, we know what happened with the Panchen Lama.
Right.
The Dalai Lama's appointed Panchen Lama got locked up, and the party appointed its own Panchen Lama, and we haven't really heard much from that. So in effect, what we see is the atrophying of the whole structure of Tibetan Buddhism and how it works as a social system within Tibetan society. So I think what they did in Tibet is exactly what they're doing in Xinjiang. They're diluting it with Han culture. They're destroying the language and the traditional religion and culture as central elements in the way all Tibetans or all Uyghurs or people in Xinjiang may see their life, and making them speak Chinese and be dependent on Beijing. And that's sort of the end of a culture.